Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Allow me to begin just by thanking the organisers of this conference for allowing me to speak here today. If you're listening to this on video, it means that either things have gotten a lot worse in the next week or that one of my kids has spilled their chocolate milk all over my laptop while doing homeschool. So please forgive me for not being able to be there and talk to you in person, albeit digitally. I'm going to talk today about the Heritage on the Edge project, which was a collaboration between three partners, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, or ICOMOS, SCI-Arc, and Google Arts and Culture. The project was launched almost exactly this time last year, which was also coincidentally the last time I left Northern Ireland. So I have very fond memories of the event and seeing many good friends there, people I haven't been able to see since. This presentation will introduce some of the background to the project and the work of ICOMOS in the area of cultural heritage. It will then introduce the project itself before finally reviewing its impact using both web metrics and some interviews. So the Heritage on the Edge project was initially envisioned at the 42nd session of the World Heritage Committee meeting in Bahrain in 2018. However, its origins can be traced to the year before, to the ICOMOS Triennial Assembly meeting in Delhi in 2017. At this assembly, and in response to a growing concern and acknowledgement about the impact of climate change on heritage sites and World Heritage in particular, a number of us submitted a resolution which emphasized, amongst other things, that our cultural heritage was both impacted by climate change, but also an asset in responding to it. It was proposed that our cultural heritage has a unique role to play in achieving the ambitions of the Paris Accord, and suggested the establishment of a working group with members from across the world to begin an exercise mapping the many ways in which culture and climate intersect, and also to develop a wider roadmap for the heritage community to engage meaningfully with climate change and policy. This exercise initially focused on 4 key themes, which eventually formed the structure of our final report, which was published in 2019. So the future of our past report is the widest ranging study of cultural heritage and climate change in existence. It has over 30 authors and was peer reviewed by over 100 experts and organizations, including, I'm sure, some people who are watching this presentation now. It was built around a wide range of key themes designed to map the Paris Accords, including loss and damage, climate adaptation, carbon mitigation, and the topic of this presentation, high ambition and communication. The basic premise is that climate change can be overwhelming and people can very quickly get lost in a forest of scientific terms and doomsday predictions. In response to that, heritage humanizes the conversation by making it people-centered. Culture and heritage are about people and things, and which are important to people. And cultural heritage also opens many angles on the climate crisis, including justice, livelihoods, migration and mitigation, identity, loss, impact solutions, and of course, urgency. Heritage then is a lens through which we can understand these wider issues in an accessible and human-centered way. So our heritage places have immense communicative power, and the Heritage on the Edge project was about using technology and people-centered media to communicate and stress urgency about climate change and the current climate emergency. So back to Bahrain then, and a meeting between ICOMOS and SCI-Arc, which led to the Heritage on the Edge project. From the outset of this project, it was important that while innovative technologies were due to play a central role, local voices should be at the forefront. And this would ensure that messages would remain people-centered and accessible to the viewer. It was also important to balance the desire for iconic sites with the need to show both the wide impacts and global nature of the crisis. For example, the impacts of sea level rise and its impact on heritage in Polynesia are well documented, but only represent a small part of the wider crisis. It was also important to find sites with climate impacts which are, as much as possible, representative of the global challenges facing heritage sites. It was also important that the project would be of use to these sites and that the data collected from the overall project would benefit those who lived and worked there. The process began with a long list of sites submitted by SIARC, ICOMOS members and national committees. Conversations were then had with relevant stakeholders, including site managers, to gauge initial interest and build initial narratives. Many sites were omitted at this point for a range of reasons, from political concerns to issues facilitating fieldwork and site visits. While initial narratives about sites, including climate impacts, responses, and other local themes, were drawn up at this point, these continued to evolve throughout the lifetime of the project, incorporating feedback from stakeholder interviews, experts, and climate science. Just to emphasize that this was not a simple linear process, but was rather an ongoing and reflexive one. We were holding meetings with some sites while we were on site at others, and in the end, 5 sites were chosen. These were Rapa Nui National Park, Chan Chan Archaeological Complex in Peru, the ruins of Kilwa Kisawani in Tanzania, the old and new towns of Edinburgh, and the mosque city of Bagarhat in Bangladesh. As aforementioned, the sites represented both a global distribution and a range of climate impacts, and this was vital to meet the aims of the project. Impacts included increased precipitation and storminess in Edinburgh to more erratic weather in Peru. Rising sea levels and coastal erosion impacted 2 sites, Rapa Nui and Kilwa Kisawani in Tanzania. Equally as important were the many cross-cutting themes that became evident at some sites, and some of these were visible prior to visits and interviews with stakeholders, while others only became clear afterwards. What I'd like to do now is just to explore one of these sites and the kind of themes that the project was able to explore during the visit. Perhaps one of the less known sites on our list was the historic mosque city of Bagarhat in Bangladesh. It was built by the famous Turkish general Khan Jahan in the 15th century and was constructed on the edge of the Sundarbans, which is one of the largest transnational World Heritage sites, which breaches the border between India and Bangladesh. It was constructed using materials sympathetic to the landscape and the environment at the time. The Sundarbans has always been a liminal and a marginal landscapes, and so the brick site was built on a foundation of stone, which stopped the permeation of water and floodwater. It was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1995 as an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscapes which illustrates a significant stage in human history. And this is criteria 4 of the World Heritage Convention's description of outstanding universal value. Bagarhat is one of these amazing World Heritage sites that continues to be a living site and landscape and is central to local and Bangladeshi national identity. It includes many mosques which continue to be used by the local population. But this population is suffering from rising sea levels across Bangladesh, which is in turn increasing the salinity of fresh water. And this is having significant health impacts on people. It's also damaging sites like Bagarhat through a process called efflorescence. So with Bagarhat, what we see are significant climate impacts to the fabric and the outstanding universal value of this site, what makes it a World Heritage Site in the first place. But we also see issues on the local community who live and work and go about their lives within this site, which touch on issues like social justice and healthcare, and also issues to do with ongoing conservation tools and methodologies. So just perhaps to provide an overview of the process of efflorescence, one of the great things we were able to do was to use the resources of Google Arts and Culture to create infographics which communicated in a very straightforward and simple and yet scientifically robust way some of these impacts, less well-known impacts at sites. So in Bangladesh, water comes up from the ground and soaks the brick. It then evaporates, and because this water is becoming increasingly salty, it leaves a layer of salt on the brick, and this salt has a corrosive acidic effect on the fabric of the buildings, and this is being felt across the site to an increasing degree as this water becomes more and more salty. So the narrative of Bagarhat, as we said before, was not just about climate impacts. It had an interesting story about historical adaptation, which went back hundreds and hundreds of years, about the construction of an enormous city on the edge of a wetland area, a story about historic climate adaptation and resilience and techniques adapted to this particular environment, such as a testimony to human resilience in a marginal landscape and a landscape that is constantly changing. We also then see the climate impacts and that traditional adaptations, which were so central to the foundation of the city, were no longer being effective. But these impacts are affecting not only the heritage of the sites, so not only the fabric of the buildings, but also the communities who live and work and go about their lives within this landscape. We're then able to focus on the reaction to these climate impacts, including monitoring and the conservation efforts of local professionals, which are incredible. People in parts of the world like Bangladesh have been developing adaptation strategies to climate change for years and years and years now, and we have so much we can learn from these places. But it also brought up the very interesting topic of social and climate justice, something that countries like Bangladesh are very, very keen to emphasize, especially in the run-up to organizations like COP, which is happening this year in Glasgow. Because Bangladesh is a very good example of one of these countries which is disproportionately suffering the impacts of climate change, really through no fault of their own. It's 144th in the world for emissions, yet it's 8th most vulnerable to climate change. And this is why many people see climate change as just another form of colonialism and imperialism that the developing world is suffering the consequences of actions of the developed world. And these were all themes that we were able to bring out within the Bagger Hat narrative. The fieldwork and data capture element on site usually lasted for about a week to 10 days. It included training with site professionals in rapid monitoring and recording of sites. It also included terrestrial laser scanning and photogrammetry to create hybrid 3D models using reality capture. This usually took about 3 to 4 days, visiting on sites where certain buildings were selected, a combination of buildings that were impacted by climate change, but also some of the more iconic buildings on site. More specifically, the kind of innovative technologies used to engage people, and many of these techniques will be familiar, were terrestrial laser scanning, photogrammetry, but perhaps what was most important in a project like this was the ability to bring in the immense knowledge and ability of an organization like Google Arts and Culture and their portal to allow people to explore the outputs of this project in really exciting and innovative ways. So if any of you do have the Google Arts and Culture app or are even looking at this on your computer while I'm talking, one of the things that they developed for this project was this use of augmented reality, where it's possible to actually have one of these structures appear on your phone and to actually walk around it, holding up your phone as you go. This giving people the ability to really experience this and straight on. And it also allowed us to bring local voices to the forefront. So we did over 100 hours of interviews with all sorts of stakeholders. These varied from site managers to politicians and policy professionals, all the way down to people who lived and worked within these landscapes, including imams in Bangladesh, town council leaders in Tanzania, tour guides, and tourists visiting these sites. So the idea here was to really capture the experience and the knowledge of the people who actually lived in these places, and to front load that in the project, so that this was really the first thing that people were going to encounter when they came to look at the actual project, when they came to experience the project. Once we collected all this information together, so all this digital data, all these interviews, all these initial narratives, we then went through a phase of having to kind of create and curate content. And this involved things like, as I said before, using these infographics. So this is just one example of the infographics from Rapa Nui, which we did by virtue of trying to communicate in an effective and accessible way the impacts of climate change on a site like this. And these were then accompanied with narrative descriptions, which people were able to read on the site looking at these issues. And as I said before, this review process was iterative, so we might have started out with a very basic narrative looking at what are the climate impacts on site, both on the heritage itself and on the socioeconomic impacts of the sites. But these narratives evolved with feedback from partners, and towards the end of the project, they became much stronger and much more inclusive to the many themes that have become apparent throughout it. So the project then was released, like I said, a year ago, pretty much this week, actually, at the end of January, start of February last year. It was simultaneously launched on Google platforms across the world. It was translated into core languages, so French and Spanish and English. It was also translated into Bangla and Swahili for our Bangladeshi and East African colleagues and market. And it got an awful lot of press online and in the traditional media, including getting the coveted spot of actually being on the bottom of the Google search page, where everybody goes to, and then they can click on it and find out, and it will take them through to this Discover How Data Help Preserve Endangered Heritage Sites. It also came with a video, a Heritage on the Edge launch video, which I'm not going to play because I don't think it'll work, but maybe it will. We can give it a try. I'm not going to play it actually in this pre-recording, and because there's too much chance of it going wrong, me not being able to fix it on time. But please do get a chance to go and look at it, because it really gives a spirit of what the project was about and what we were trying to do. So the function of the Heritage on the Edge project was to try and raise awareness. So it was important for us that the project didn't just stop once we had released it. We had to keep an eye on how it was doing, on who was looking at it, and how much airtime it was actually getting. One of the ways we were able to do this was to look at the data that we were getting. And we did this, started off looking at the first 6 months of the project. So this is just up until June. We're currently looking at these statistics for the latter part of last year, but we haven't had a chance to actually process them yet. By June, it had nearly 300,000 visits. So that's individual visits to the web portal. And one of the things we were able to do was to look at where people were visiting from, but also which sites were the most popular. And it's perhaps unsurprising that the most iconic sites, so for example, Rapa Nui and Edinburgh, were standout favorites amongst people visiting this site, whereas the lesser known sites were visited substantially less. Interestingly, we saw a very, very sharp rise in the number of people visiting this. And then around April, May, of course, COVID happened. And a lot of our media coverage that we had planned to promote the project actually kind of petered away because world interest was focused elsewhere, and that's perfectly understandable. The project remains live and people continue to visit it, and these numbers are up now to kind of just below 750,000 people have visited the site up until now. Given that the aim of this project was to be as globally inclusive as possible, and unfortunately, we were a little disappointed by how wide-ranging and where people were visiting from. So it is perhaps unsurprising that the vast majority of visitors were coming to the site from the developed world, from North America, from Australia, and from Europe. And we were seeing substantially lower visitation numbers from other parts of the world. And when we kind of break that down and look into different countries and people looking at different countries and where they're coming from, we are seeing some regionality. So the most iconic sites, Edinburgh and Rapa Nui, are being visited really quite uniformly from people all over the world. Other sites are being much more locally visited. So we see an increase in visitation, for example, to people coming and looking at the exhibits on Bagger Hat. Obviously, there's quite a lot of people visiting from Bangladesh and from the surrounding areas, and similarly in Peru, we're seeing an increase in number of people visiting from Latin America, for example, here. So we are seeing these regional differences, but we're not seeing the levels of accessibility that we were hoping we would see especially from in-country people and regional people from near those countries. And this, I think, we'll come back to this, but this is actually one of the failings of projects like this, is this idea of technology and access to technology and internet justice, which I think comes through when we're talking about digital tools, and not just in this project, but in many, many types of projects. Interestingly, considering our attempt was to bring people in with iconic heritage and then create exhibits and things for people to look at that would engage them and hopefully inform them more about climate impact and the kind of cross-cutting themes relevant to that, our viewing times were actually really, really good. So what viewing time is how long people actually spend on a website. So if you're like me, I tend to click on most websites, read the headline, read maybe the first paragraph, and then something else has caught my attention and I moved on. And we were keen to try and avoid that because we really wanted people to engage with the content. So on Heritage on the Edge, we had two types of exhibits. We had assets, and assets could be anything from a single photograph right the way up to a very detailed and interactive 3D model of a site or a series of interviews with people. And then we had stories, and stories were where we had most of our narrative texts. These were written by ICOMOS and other experts from around the world in things like climate science and heritage science and technology. And these were longer bits of text, and they were kind of different types of media and different assets were kind of splined in and out of these stories and narratives. But they were certainly aimed to engage people for a bit longer. And so we obviously had lots and lots of different assets. So it's on, like I said, every single thing from a photograph to a video was an assets. And these got about 29% of the views to the site. And interestingly, these had a mean viewing time. So this is how long people spent looking at them, of 58 seconds, so just under a minute. So this is obviously accounting for the fact that some people will spend 5 seconds looking at a photograph, but will spend 10 minutes exploring a large 3D model of a building and walking through it and zooming in and looking at all the detail. From a communicative perspective, we were perhaps surprised to see that the mean viewing time on stories, so these are the larger narratives, roughly about 500 to 600 words, people were spending about 2 minutes on them. And they were also getting an awful lot of views. And we were really, really happy to see this, because this means that people were being brought in maybe from some of the media, and then were engaging and using that media to further explore and engage with some of these important themes and some of these important topics, which we really wanted to communicate as part of the project. Of course, much of how people look at technology like this is dependent on what kind of platform they are doing it from. It'll be perhaps unsurprising to anybody here who works in the developing world to learn that most countries there have actually just leapfrogged traditional technological platforms like desktop computers and laptops directly to mobile and cellular devices. And it has often been my experience that I had better 4G coverage in parts of India or Southeast Asia than I do in large parts of Ireland. And so this was important when thinking about how people were viewing this content, because for us, perhaps most of us would view it sitting on our desktop computers in our offices or at home. And the actual content was curated and designed using the Google Arts and Culture platform to be perhaps optimally viewed from a mobile environment. So the Google Arts and Culture app, which you can download on your phone, was widely used. And this gave viewers added ability to engage with some of the material from the project. So when we look at countries with the highest desktop views, it's perhaps unsurprising that most of these are in the kind of Western world, the developed world, so Portugal, USA, Canada, and the highest percentage of mobile views then are in parts of the world that we kind of traditionally have less viewership from. So Iran up at 73%, India, Russia, Turkey, all up in the 60s, and Thailand all up in the 60%. And indeed, if we look at a kind of geographical distribution of these views, so specifically these maps close to this pie chart here, we can see how mobile views are just substantially larger in Africa, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, where the vast majority of people were viewing this on their phones. And I think that tells us an awful lot about how we need to be preparing our data and how we need to be serving our data on projects like this within the future. What was also interesting is that if we look at rankings for sites within their own kind of neighborhood, so if we look at the rankings of sites within East Africa and Southeast Asia, we can see that viewers from some sites were focusing, for some reasons, were focusing much more on regional sites, and other areas were having a much wider. They were visiting sites from around the world. So in places like Bagarhat, for example, Bangladesh is the fourth most common visiting place for that, but is 34th overall for the project. So data only tells us one part of this story. Of course, if we go back to what the aims of this project were, they were to work with local partners in a way that was beneficial for their sites. And so following late summer, Casey Haddock and I from SciArc did a series of interviews with site managers and other partners from each of these sites. And excuse the rather wordy slide here, I will summarize it for you, but a couple of really interesting things jumped out of this as to what we did right, what we certainly didn't do right, and most definitely what we could do better. And I think this kind of honest debrief and review is very, very important when working sites like this. The site was delivered the whole project was actually delivered very quickly. We got the whole thing conceived of, delivered, and to this stage reviewed really within the case of about 18 months. But of course, anybody who works on projects like this will know that time and pressure are often things that lead to errors being made or corners being cut within a project. And I think we certainly saw that here. And it was a question of balancing those things out against the urgency of a project like this and the message it was bringing. So partners generally, in fact, all of them felt that being involved in the project was worthwhile and beneficial. They were specifically very, very interested in these technologies and how these technologies could be used. And indeed, I think what we would do in subsequent projects is to spend an awful lot more time doing knowledge exchange and capacity building, because in instances where we did go through more detailed training with people, these sites are still using those techniques, specifically photogrammetry and the use of UAVs. Laser scanners are a separate issue because they're very expensive, and they take ongoing maintenance contracts really to use them systematically over a long period of time for monitoring. What was interesting here is that the final output, so the actual portal itself where people were going to go, was of pretty limited importance at most sites. Like I said, sites were far more interested in the data capture and how that data could be used within their sites. All sites felt that the publicity of the project, both nationally and internationally, was beneficial. In some cases, this led to extra resources nationally, so from government and ministry. In some cases, actually probably led directly to extra funding on heritage adaptation and climate adaptation from bodies like UNESCO and the World Heritage Council. It was also noted, like I said before, that the training offered during the project had resulted in improved recording and conservation practices, and this was one of our aims of the project from the outset, that it wasn't just a question of us turning up with kit and doing something fancy, and that actually we could spend time training. And also what's interesting is that 4 out of these 5 sites from this project we've now since gone on between the partners, either between SciArc or ICOMOS, to lead to large funded research projects involving these sites. So the relationship which might have started with this project has evolved, and we now continue to work with these partners on much larger sites, which include much greater focuses on training and recording. And indeed, this was one of the things that people felt really beneficial was this idea to network, because of course, when you start looking at the impacts of sea level rise on a site in Bangladesh and a site in Tanzania and a site like Rapa Nui, you suddenly realize that actually these people share a lot of experiences, and they also have a lot of professional knowledge in adaptation, which can be beneficial to other sites. And this kind of idea of creating a network of heritage professionals was deemed to be very, very useful. Improvement opportunities, and it's perhaps unsurprising that there were many of these, like there should be in any kind of honest review of a project, would be to take more time to identify and engage with local people and expertise, and I think that's something that we absolutely acknowledged. The editorial process needs to be longer and involve more local partners, so an awful lot of our narrative creation happened towards the end of the project when we were able to bring all our data together and look at it all in one place. But I think it would have been better had we engaged in that kind of reflexive process in much more in the build up to site visits, and had many more conversations. And indeed, one of the points one of our site managers pointed out was that in this COVID world now, talking to people and connecting with people is so much easier. And in fact, a lot of those conversations and interviews were things that probably could have been done before we even visited the site, so that we could have maximized the opportunity of actually being there. Like I said before, training is just as important as recording, but sites also need access to hardware and training, and there's no point in going and saying this is how you use a laser scanner, unless you're actually building in the capacity for them to have access to that kind of hardware. And like I said, some of these follow-on projects we have now are aiming to do that and equip some of these sites in a better way. One of the key things is that more effort needs to be made to make the results available to the local community. We were very surprised, although maybe we shouldn't have been, to realize in our interviews after the events that very few people in both Kilowatt and Baggerhash were even aware that the Google Arts and Culture project existed. People did not have the kind of access to be able to look at things on their phones. Some of these communities were quite impoverished. So people just, when we asked them, do you think people in the area liked the project? The response we got was, I don't think people in the area have seen the project. And I think there's a real ethical onus on us to make our results more accessible. And if they cannot be accessible using the digital media that we're using in the project, then we need to make them accessible in other ways. And so once COVID is finished, we've talked about going back and organizing events, or perhaps just not going back, but creating resources for events for our local partners to be able to run to highlight what we did in the project. So in conclusion then, iconic sites are undoubtedly powerful tools to stress climate urgency and encourage action. And I think that the power of these places to do that was very clear, and the results from this project show that it was largely effective in communicating the value globally. However, care is needed not to use these sites at the expense of local custodians. And we need to think about this when we think about the kind of technologies, the kind of media, and the kind of training that we're able to offer. Because if we're not careful, these can reinforce existing digital inequalities. As I said before, really from the origins of this project, the idea was to start relationships with these sites, both to work with them, but also to facilitate learning from them. Really, in all cases here, these sites were the start of ongoing professional collaborations and relationships. So I'd like to thank these people, the members of the ICOMOS Working Group on Climate Change and Cultural Heritage, who added as kind of climate experts on some of these sites, Heritage on the Edge project partners, so that would especially be Casey Haddock and Chance from Google Arts and Culture, national committees, all the people who worked with us to make this project possible, and in particular our local site partners, many of whom, as I said, we're continuing to work with from these incredible sites around the world. Thank you very much.